Hello, and thanks for joining us for Prepped and Polished Education and Inspiration. I'm your host, Alexis Avila, educator, online entrepreneur, and founder of tutoring and test prep firm Prepped and Polished, broadcasting today from South Natick, Massachusetts. Prepped and Polished Education and Inspiration is your destination for groundbreaking insight from today's most influential educators, leaders, and minds on the planet. Our show is brought to you today by Wilsey Connections. My friend Pam Wilsey is a therapist for moms and teens and rolled out a new program for graduating seniors called Freshman 2.0 College Bound to help ease the transition to college. Check out wilseyconnections.com for more info. And get to know the Prepped and Polished community. You can find us on Facebook at Prepped and Polished, as well as on Twitter at Prepped Polished. And thank you to everyone for tuning in. Joining our show today is Julie Leven. Julie is a professional violinist who has performed throughout the U.S., Europe, and Asia. She's also executive and artistic director of Shelter Music Boston, which is an organization that presents classical chamber music concerts of the highest artistic standards in homeless shelters and other sheltering environments. And Julie has degrees from both BU, Boston University School of Management, Institute for Nonprofit Management and Leadership, and at Oberlin College and Conservatory. We're grateful to have Julie on our show. She's going to share with us the amazing work she does providing classical music performances to homeless shelters. To our listeners, you can submit a question at any time, radio@preppedandpolished.com. We always appreciate hearing from you. Julie, thank you so much for joining us. How are you today?
I'm fine. Thank you so much for having me. I'm thrilled to speak about Shelter Music Boston to your audience.
Great. So before we get to that, tell us just a little bit about your background. Where do you come from?
I grew up in St. Louis, Missouri. I, as you said, went to school in Oberlin and in Boston. I've been working as a professional musician since I finished Oberlin. I've had a couple of orchestra jobs in other countries, including Israel and Denmark. And I've been living in Boston since the late 80s, working as a musician. I play in the Boston Pops, in the Handel and Haydn Society. I travel quite a bit in the U.S. to play chamber music. And I have a daughter who, in fact, is college bound, about to leave home to start college. And that is my short story.
Great. So let's just backtrack just a little. A lot of our listeners are teenagers. So what were you like as a teen?
Well, I was a pretty serious musician. I did start playing the violin when I was 9 years old, and
Wow.
I knew right away that I wanted to be a violinist, having absolutely no idea what that meant in that wonderful, bright-eyed 9-year-old way. And I did really like playing it. Initially, I liked the feel of the instrument. I liked the sound, and I became quickly very interested in classical music. And so as a teenager, I played in the St. Louis Symphony Youth Orchestra. I went to a couple summers of music camp in Massachusetts, in fact, which was where I first was exposed to Tanglewood and all the amazing music and arts performances that take place in Western Massachusetts every summer. And I was extremely excited by that. I certainly remember as a teenager hearing certain pieces of music, in particular one piece by Brahms, the Brahms Horn Trio, which is for violin, piano, and French horn. And I wanted desperately to have that, to own that piece, to be able to play it. And I was driven by that desire until in college when I finally was able to play and perform that piece. So I was pretty intense as a teenager, I guess.
Wow.
To sum it all up.
And
I was very interested in community service. I have to add, I am a lifelong lover of animals, and I was a junior member of the Humane Society in St. Louis, and I would save up little bits of my allowance to send to help out with animal care. And I just identified with beings who were less fortunate, who needed a hand, and that certainly has continued throughout my life.
Definitely. And growing up, who were some of your influences?
Well, I was influenced significantly by music teachers. In fact, the very first violin teacher I had was a trombone player, which is sort of unusual, but the year that I started playing in my public school violin class, which was a free class, and thank goodness for arts in the schools, the teacher who taught that violin class that year was the same as was the band teacher, and of course he, as a music educator, had learned string methods, so was qualified to teach a beginner on the violin. And I just loved him. He was smart and funny, and he loved music, and I'm sure that was a contributing factor to my liking the violin so much as a 9-year-old.
Absolutely.
Along the way, other violin teachers that influenced me were certainly my high school violin teacher, who was the concertmaster of the St. Louis Symphony at the time, and he had studied with one of the greatest American violin teachers, so I was privileged to be able to learn from a master. One of my greatest mentors was someone I encountered in college, wonderful Hungarian musician named Eugene Lehner, who played in the Boston Symphony for many years. And I was lucky enough to study with him many times, and he knew famous composers of the 20th century, most prominent of which was Bartók, one of my composition heroes. I love the music of Bartók. So I was also very interested in, as I said, animal welfare, and the story of the lions in the Born Free saga was very compelling to me. It was a true story. I became interested in Joy and George Adamson, the naturalists who had gone to Africa and been successful in returning lions to the wild. And I followed their lives until the end of their lives. In fact, they both died in the 90s, I believe. So those twin interests continued throughout.
Wow. And, you know, what does it take for an aspiring musician to go from good to great?
Well, a lot of patience, a lot of practice. We certainly see these days this number of 10,000 hours thrown around, that you need to play an instrument 10,000 hours to become excellent. I would say that I certainly put in my time. I practiced many hours, starting in high school throughout college. As a music major, it's absolutely requisite to spend many hours practicing. And I continue to do that. Being a musician, being a working musician is quite like being an athlete. You have to stay in shape. You have to exercise. You have to maintain your edge. So you practice. As, of course, an athlete would work out and train. And then there's sort of the magic of it, I suppose, you know, the gift of being able to communicate music, having a desire to communicate through music, and wanting to communicate my understanding of a piece to an audience, to listeners, and being driven to find a way to do that. And that way consists of practicing and exploring the music, and being lucky to have good teachers and mentors who provide valuable insight and coaching on how to become a communicative and successful musician.
Wow. And on your website, from your bio, it seems like you travel the world performing all over the world. Are there a few places that stand out in your mind that you just really enjoy traveling to and playing?
Sure. I have been very, very lucky to play in many of the world's great concert halls. I played in Royal Albert Hall in London, and that is just such an amazing concert hall, historically important. I've played in Suntory Hall in Tokyo, also a gorgeous hall, and many beautiful concert halls in the U.S. I played in Poland, actually, the Messiah, the piece by Handel, and the performance was so well received that the audience would not stop clapping. In fact, and the piece is almost 3 hours long, so it's quite a journey to both perform that and to participate as an audience member. And for the first and only time in my career, we actually had to play an encore so that the audience they just wanted more music. So, of course, the Hallelujah chorus is one of the best-known pieces in the Messiah, so we played that again. And they went crazy. They loved it. And we finally had to leave the stage, actually. They wouldn't stop clapping. So that was quite an honor and inspiring to be so well received and to have the music appreciated so much.
Oh, definitely.
And in fact, that was very interesting. Poland, of course, has many troubled times in history in its background, and I am Jewish, and of course Poland was the site of the most of the concentration camps during World War II, and there were a number of us in that ensemble who also were Jewish and probably wouldn't have been there had our ancestors and family members not fled that exact same geographical area. So I found that very interesting to be able to return with music and to be so well received. Of course, the context was very different, but I could see that perhaps I never would have gotten there had my family members not left. So,
wow,
very interesting travel experience.
That's incredible.
Yeah.
On your website, Shelter Music Boston, the prospectus says, Shelter Music Boston presents classical chamber music concerts of the highest artistic standards in Boston homeless shelters. How did you come up with the idea of Shelter Music Boston?
Well, the original inspiration came from an article I read in the New York Times about a violinist who had played in a shelter in New York. She had wanted to run through a concert program that she was going to be performing in a conventional concert hall. And her husband had said, well, why don't you come down to the soup kitchen where I'm volunteering and play it for the guys? And she thought, wow, really? And play that music? I don't know. But she said, okay, I'll give it a try. And the folks loved it. And so she started an organization where she takes chamber music that is being prepared to be performed in conventional venues. She takes it to the homeless shelter to run through the program as her ensemble is performing, as they prepare to perform in a conventional concert environment. I loved that idea, but I didn't want it to be an organization that would prepare the concerts on the way to somewhere else. I decided I want to do that in Boston. I want to take music to environments that are desperately in need of the beauty and the dignity and the passion of classical music. And I only want to produce the concerts there. So that was what I decided to start. We started off in the Shattuck shelter in Jamaica Plain because I have a friend who is a psychiatrist there, and I said to her, how could I play at the shelter where you work? And so she connected me with the appropriate person who I went to visit, and who later told me that she thought I was just really kind of missing the boat here. What were the shelter guests going to do with classical music? But she was willing to let me give it a try. And she realized in the first 5 minutes of the first concert that this was a great thing. And since then has become a wonderful advocate for the organization. We have been playing at the Shattuck shelter in Jamaica Plain for 4 years now, a concert every month.
Wow.
And we consider ourselves a residence ensemble there because we do visit regularly. Sadly, some of the folks we play for have been at every concert, and I say sadly because that means they have not been able to find permanent housing. On the other hand, we are just about the only consistent element of beauty and dignity that is presented to them on a regular basis in the shelter. Of course, the shelter services are always presented to the guests in a dignified fashion, and the shelters work very hard to make people comfortable, but it's a challenge, and the shelters are mainly providing sometimes a meal and, in the case of the Shattuck, always a bed. They just don't have the resources to do what we do. So we are adding to the capacity for the shelter to provide something that addresses the human dignity of the folks who are struggling in that environment.
Wow. And by the way, it's a small world because my dad's a psychiatrist and JP, so they probably know each other.
Wow.
Yeah.
Yeah, indeed. If he works on that path of sort of social services and all, he might indeed know the psychiatrist who referred me to the Shattuck. And in fact, I see what we provide in the shelter on the same spectrum as the psychiatrist who is able to see the shelter guests once a month, or social worker who can see the shelter guests once a month. We are all addressing the humanness of these folks who are struggling within the context of the shelter, which is trying to provide them with a roof over their head and somewhere to stay out of the elements. But it takes a team, and we, of course, are able to address some of these issues, emotional issues, without words. The music is very emotional. The people hear stories in the music. Our concerts are extremely interactive. We always encourage our audiences to ask questions, to learn about the music. We really want to bust open that classical music can be exclusive and that it's only for a certain set of people, because, of course, the music is communicating stories and emotions about being human, and that means it's for everyone.
Sure.
And our audiences have found that they can find something in classical music, in fact, that they like it. One of my favorite comments that recurs regularly from different audience members is something to the effect of, wow, I never heard this before. I didn't think I was going to like classical music. This is awesome. I love this stuff. I want to hear more. So,
wow.
And the audience members are starting to make use of the classical music as well. People are listening to classical music more on their own handheld devices. Just about everyone in the shelter is carrying a cell phone and or an iPod, and people do listen to music. And what happens during our concerts is people feel calm and respected, and they want to recreate those feelings. So they're turning to classical music to do that.
Wow.
So the music has a therapeutic effect. We are not music therapists, but the effect of the concerts is definitely therapeutic, both on the individuals and on the environment. Because the staff tell us that after every concert, the environment is more calm. Shelter guests go to sleep earlier because they're more relaxed. And that, of course, makes it easier for the shelter staff to deliver the various services throughout the shelter if everyone is more calm and relaxed. The environment typically is quite volatile. So having something that comes in and makes people feel calm and happy is an enormous benefit to the shelter environment as well as to the individual.
Oh, no kidding. Now, what has Shelter Music Boston become since your early days? I know that you mentioned the Shattuck shelter. Are there other shelters that you've targeted as well and worked with?
Yes, in fact, now we perform every month in 7 shelters.
Oh, wow.
We're busy. We play at the Shattuck, as I said. We play at Pine Street, both the men's and the women's inns. So when we visit Pine Street, we actually play 2 back-to-back concerts in the separate venues that are, of course, the building is connected, but the inns are separated. We play at Hastings House, which is a family shelter. So we're playing for young mothers with very young children who are being exposed to classical music. And one of the things that's remarkable that happens there is that the moms and the children are actually calmly relating to one another as a result of the music. And those folks are, of course, also in a stressful time. Being homeless and being a young mom with a young child is not calming. So the fact that we bring in something that they share and learn from, and as well have a calm feeling, is tremendous for them. We also play at the Community Day Center in Waltham, and we play at the Caspar Emergency Center in Cambridge. And did I get it? Oh, and the Dimmock Center in Roxbury, which is, we're not playing in the homeless shelter component of the Dimmock Center, but in a residential treatment program for women who are recovering from addiction. Okay. And these women are finding tremendous use in the classical music. These women are learning how to cope and acquire skills now that they are sober and trying to stay sober. And many of those women are finding that the music indeed makes them feel really happy and energized in a way that they used to try to find by turning to drugs. And so some of the women are saying, wow, this is amazing. I'm going to listen to this classical music to get this great feeling. I feel happy when I hear this music.
Wow.
It's really an honor to be able to bring that to someone by playing my violin. I feel that when I play in these shelter concerts, I can change someone's life every time I play my violin there, and that is a tremendous honor and a privilege to be able to do that with classical music.
Absolutely. What has been your biggest struggle for you and when implementing music programs in shelters? Any resistance?
No, certainly not from the shelter staff or the shelter guests. I would say, like any nonprofit, the biggest challenge is to be able to fund the services that the organization is providing. The musicians are doing high-level professional work and have committed to this job as a chamber musician in residence in various shelters, and so the musicians are paid for their work. I am very much in favor of the model that Boston Healthcare for the Homeless program implemented, that when they started in 1985, they said, we're not having volunteer physicians because we want the doctors to make commitment to this population for the consistency that this population needs. And that's exactly the model I use. I want the musicians to commit to the work, and musicians are committing to the work as well as committing to the idea, the innovation of classical music being able to create social change in an environment such as a shelter. So this is a job for these musicians, and therefore, as I said, in any nonprofit, funding the delivery of services is always one of the biggest challenges.
Right.
And so I do that. I am fundraising and writing grants and finding donors who feel, as I do, that classical music can make social change and want to see this organization become successful in the future and sustainable, which is the path we are on, thankfully. And I'm very excited to be shepherding Shelter Music Boston along on this journey.
That's amazing. After listening to one of your performances, one of the sheltered guests was quoted as saying, I heard the words of people speaking kindly to each other in the music. What do you think this person heard during your performance, and what did it mean for this person to listen to classical music at a homeless shelter?
Well, I think what the person heard was how we rely on each other and communicate with one another when we play chamber music. I remember that evening. I remember that gentleman. He often has very poignant observations, and he expresses them very clearly when he talks with us after the concerts. And he, as he did say a little bit more about that to me, I know that he did mean that he was inspired to see that we could count on each other in the music. And that, that without explaining that in words, we could communicate that in this world, people can count on each other. And in fact, I think that it might have been something that happened in that performance. There was trouble with a page turn or something. So someone, one of us had to adjust to the other one. And, we helped each other out when there was a little trouble on the path. And, I think that inspired this gentleman to have a little bit of hope for people and for, people around him, hopefully, being able to lend him a hand. A lot of the folks in this population it's difficult for them to trust people who want to help because of the circumstances of their lives. They've had a lot of rough stuff. And so, I think in the case of that comment, he saw trust, and it helped him to see that and to hear it and to hear beauty emerge from that.
Wow. It clearly inspired him. We have a lot of teens who listen to the show. So I was just wondering, when you're a teen, you're really confused because, you're off to college and you're off to the working world, and it can be in quite a daunting time. What piece of advice would you have for a teen kind of struggling through this time?
I would say, take the time to know what is in your heart. And that means get off your FaceTime and your Facebook and, maybe listen to music without interruption, whatever kind of music you like. It doesn't need to be classical music. I'm, of course, advocating that, but the thing that's great about music is there's something for everyone. And find what you are passionate about. And it doesn't have to always be the same thing, but find what's going to drive you to do something that adds value to the world, that is meaningful to you, that will compel you and keep you going, and that you can look back at and say, wow, I put a lot of energy into that, and that was worth it. And of course, it's tough to know when you're 17, 16, what am I going to look back and see? You're not there yet, because it'll be a while before you want to look back, but and go with integrity, I would say. Passion and integrity.
Absolutely. So how can we find you, Julie? And can you just plug yourself on how we can find you and help you?
Absolutely. sheltermusicboston.org is the website, and you can reach me by emailing me, julie@sheltermusicboston.org. That information is, of course, available on the website, and I would certainly encourage listeners to take a look at the website. We have quite a bit of information of responses to the surveys that we do after each concert, and the words of the shelter guests are very inspiring. Also because these folks, in our culture, we have an expectation that someone who's in the shelter, they're this or that. And what I've found is everybody in the shelter is a human being, just like everybody who is not in the shelter. And
Sure.
Everyone wants to connect and relate and have a dignified interaction before they go to sleep that night.
That's amazing. Well, thank you so much, Julie. We appreciate you coming on, and
You're very welcome. Thank you for having me.
And great. Well, this wraps up our show today with Julie Leven, violinist and executive and artistic director of Shelter Music Boston. To learn more about Julie and Shelter Music Boston and contribute to the Shelter Music Boston mission, then please visit sheltermusicboston.org. Thank you for joining us on Prepped and Polished Education and Inspiration.